There's a specific kind of quiet you get on lakefront property early in the morning. Not silence exactly. The water moves, birds argue in the tree line, something always rustles in the grass along the bank, but it's a particular kind of peace that you don't find anywhere else. And when I bought that land 7 years ago, that quiet was half the reason I signed the papers. I'd driven past that lot 3 times before I ever stopped. Just a narrow strip of lakefront on the east side of Crescent Lake, about 200 feet of shoreline, trees thick on the back end, a gentle slope down to the water. The previous owner had left an old dock in decent shape, and I remember standing on the end of it that afternoon before closing, looking at the reflection of the pines in the water, thinking this was the smartest purchase I'd ever make. I wasn't wrong about the land, I was just completely wrong about what came next. I didn't build on it right away. That was always the plan. Eventually, a small cabin, nothing extravagant, something I could retreat to on weekends. But life has a way of pushing those timelines. Work got busy, then my father got sick, and for 3 years I only visited the lot a handful of times. I kept the taxes current, had a neighbor named Dale a half-mile up the road keep an eye on it for me, and figured when the time was right, I'd start building. The land wasn't going anywhere. Except apparently it was. I found out what had happened the way you find out about most disasters, too late, when the damage was already deep. A buddy of mine sent me a text in late October, said he'd driven past Crescent Lake and noticed construction, new homes going up on the east shoreline, luxury ones. I remember reading his message twice, feeling something cold settle in my stomach, because there was only one patch of east shoreline with enough space for new construction, mine. I drove out there the next morning and stood at the edge of my property, or what used to be clearly my property, staring at a framing crew putting up the skeleton of what looked like a high-end lakefront home. A second foundation had already been poured 30 feet south of it. My dock was gone, just gone. A construction trailer sat roughly where my tree line had been, and on the door of that trailer was a logo I recognized immediately because I'd been seeing it on yard signs throughout the county for 2 years. Lakeview Estates, HOA, Development Division. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment, because it wasn't just anger. It was a strange, almost disorienting confusion. Like arriving at your parking spot and finding a stranger's car so perfectly placed that for a second you wonder if you're in the wrong lot. I stood there genuinely questioning myself. Had I missed some notice? Had I signed something I didn't understand? I pulled up my deed on my phone right there in the mud and read through it again just to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't losing my mind. I walked to the construction trailer and knocked. A man in a hard hat opened the door, looked at me like I was mildly inconvenient, and told me the site supervisor wasn't available. I told him that was fine. I just needed to know who authorized construction on private property. He blinked, said he was just following permits. I asked him who pulled those permits. He shrugged and pointed at the HOA logo on the door like that explained everything, then went back inside. That was a Friday. By Monday morning, I was sitting in my attorney's office. Here's where it started getting complicated in a way I didn't expect. My attorney, Marcus, is the kind of man who speaks slowly on purpose. He thinks before every sentence. He looked over my deed, looked over the parcel records I'd pulled from the county assessor's website, and then he got very quiet in a way that made me nervous. He pulled up something on his computer and turned the screen toward me. There was a recorded easement on my property, a utility and access easement filed 18 months ago that had apparently been used as the legal foundation for the HOA's development claim. The easement itself was legitimate, filed correctly, recorded with the county, but it only granted access, not development rights, not ownership. Marcus said someone had taken a real document and stretched it about 6 jurisdictions past what it actually permitted. What I didn't know yet was who had filed it, and that detail was going to matter more than I could have anticipated. I started getting calls that week, not from the HOA's legal department, not from a contractor or a project manager, from a woman named Karen Whitfield. She introduced herself as the HOA's community liaison,
which I later learned was a title she had essentially given herself after volunteering enough committees to achieve a kind of self-appointed authority. She was pleasant on the first call, professionally pleasant, the way people are when they've already decided the conversation is beneath them but are performing courtesy for the record. She explained that Lakeview Estates had been planning this development for 3 years, that the easement was properly recorded, that the project had county approval, and any concerns I had should be directed through the formal dispute resolution process outlined in the HOA's governing documents.
I told her I didn't live in the HOA. She paused just long enough for me to realize she already knew that. She said it didn't matter. The land, she explained, fell within the HOA's planned expansion boundary. I asked her when that boundary had been defined. She said it had always been there. I asked her to show me the documentation. She told me it would be made available through the dispute process. Then she thanked me for my time and ended the call. I didn't sleep well that night. Marcus started digging into the county records the following week, and what he found was strange enough that he called me on a Saturday afternoon, which he had never done before. The easement filing referenced a parcel number, not my parcel number, a neighboring parcel that shared a boundary with mine. Someone, at some point in the filing process, had either made an error that nobody caught or had very deliberately used an adjacent parcel reference to obscure what was actually happening. Marcus said he wasn't ready to call it fraud yet, but he also said he wasn't ready not to. Meanwhile, construction had not stopped. I'd sent a certified letter to the HOA demanding a work halt. They sent back a 2-paragraph response saying they were confident in their legal standing and would continue operations while the matter was under review. I drove out to the site 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. The framing on the first house was nearly complete. The second foundation was being built up. My shoreline, 200 feet of it, was being integrated into what would eventually be the backyard of 2 high-end properties that the HOA planned to sell for somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 each. The third time I drove out there, Karen Whitfield was standing at the site. She was talking to the crew foreman, clipboard in hand, wearing a vest with the HOA logo on it. She saw me pull up and her expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. Not guilty, more like prepared. She walked toward my truck before I'd even finished shutting the door, and she started talking while I was still stepping out, which told me she'd already thought through how this conversation was going to go. She said I needed to stop coming to the site. She said I was creating an uncomfortable environment for the workers. I told her I was standing on my own property. She said that was a matter currently under review. I told her no, actually, it wasn't a matter under review, it was a matter of recorded deed, and I'd be happy to show her the document if she needed a refresher. Something changed in her face then. The professional pleasantness dropped just for a second, and what was underneath it was colder than I expected. She told me I should think carefully about how aggressive I wanted to be, because the HOA had resources I probably didn't. I went home and called Marcus. He filed for a temporary restraining order on a Thursday. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday. I remember those 5 days feeling like they moved at 2 different speeds. Each individual hour dragged, but somehow the days disappeared. I kept checking the county records portal, kept rereading the easement document, kept trying to find the thing I was missing, the piece that explained how any rational person could have believed this was legal. And then the Sunday before the hearing, Dale called me. Dale, the neighbor who'd been keeping an eye on my land for years. He was out for an early walk and passed by the site and noticed something. The construction crew was working on a Sunday morning at 7 a.m. Not a full crew, just 4 or 5 guys, but they were working. And they were working fast, like they were trying to get something done before Tuesday. I drove out there. What happened next happened quickly. I parked, walked to the edge of the active construction zone, and tried to take photographs of what they were doing with the shoreline. Karen Whitfield's car was there. I hadn't expected that. She came out of the trailer within 60 seconds of my arrival, and this time there was no clipboard, no professional courtesy, no careful language. She told me to get off the property. I told her, again, that it was my property. She pulled out her phone and called 911. I want you to understand what that felt like. I have never in my life had anyone call the police on me. I stood there while she talked to the dispatcher, describing me as an aggressive individual trespassing on an active construction site, and I felt something I can only describe as a deep, almost surreal calm, because I realized something in that moment that she had not. The deputy who showed up was a man named Garrett. I'd spoken to him once before at a county roads meeting about a drainage issue near the lake. He was the kind of officer who took his time getting out of the car, not because he was slow, but because he was paying attention before he even reached the situation. He listened to Karen for about 2 minutes. She explained the trespassing claim, the ongoing dispute, the fact that I kept returning to the site. Then he looked at me. I handed him my deed. I handed him the parcel map Marcus had prepared showing the exact boundaries of my property. I handed him a copy of the certified letter the HOA had received and their response confirming they were aware of my ownership claim. Garrett looked through everything. He looked at Karen. He asked her, very calmly, if the HOA had a document that superseded a recorded deed. She said the easement covered development rights. He asked to see it. She went to the trailer and came back with a copy. He read it. He read it again. He asked her 3 questions. What parcel does this easement reference? What parcel is this construction on? Who authorized work on a Sunday in advance of a court hearing scheduled for Tuesday? Karen started to answer the first question and then stopped. Garrett got back on his radio. What I didn't know, what nobody had told me, was that the county had flagged the easement filing 6 weeks earlier during a routine audit. There was already an open inquiry. The parcel number discrepancy Marcus had found wasn't just a civil matter, it had been referred to the county's fraud unit 3 weeks ago. Garrett knew about it. He'd been briefed on it because his district covered the lake area. Karen didn't know any of that. She was still standing there trying to explain the easement when Garrett's supervisor arrived. The conversation that followed was brief and one-sided. The supervisor had documents I hadn't seen, internal HOA communications that had been subpoenaed as part of the fraud inquiry, communications in which Karen had been CC on emails discussing how to use the easement filing to establish a development foothold on my parcel before I could be notified and respond. She hadn't just known about the plan, she'd been coordinating it. The handcuffs went on quietly. There was no dramatic scene, no shouting, no real struggle. Karen Whitfield stood very still while Garrett placed her under arrest for filing a fraudulent county document and conspiracy to commit property fraud. The construction crew had all stopped working by then. Nobody said anything. The Sunday morning quiet came back. That particular lake quiet I'd described to myself 7 years ago when I first stood on that dock. The dock wasn't there anymore, but the land was still mine. The restraining order hearing 2 days later was almost anticlimactic. The HOA's attorney showed up, saw what was on the table, and asked for a recess that turned into a 40-minute private conversation with Marcus. The TRO was granted. Construction stopped permanently. The HOA's development arm filed for dissolution 4 months later, partly because 2 of their board members were named in the same fraud inquiry. The homes they'd started were never finished. The county ordered them demolished as unauthorized structures. I watched them come down on a Wednesday in February, standing on the bank of my land. And I'll be honest with you, it didn't feel like victory exactly. It felt like getting something back that never should have been taken. There's a difference, and it's a quiet one. I've started the cabin now, just the foundations so far, set back from the water the way I always planned. My dock is rebuilt, same spot as before, same old view. I still go out there on early mornings sometimes and stand at the end of it, listening to the lake do what it does. And every once in a while I think about Karen Whitfield, about that split second when her professional mask dropped and she told me to think carefully about how aggressive I wanted to be. I wonder sometimes if she ever thought I'd call that bluff.